is then modified by the independent BIOS vendors like AMI, Phoenix, and Inside. They go ahead and add value to the systems, right? They have to compete amongst each other in order to say what new features they've added that the other guys haven't added, and that's how they're going to get OEMs to buy theirs. And then the OEMs buy and maybe manipulate if they've got enough BIOS if they've got enough BIOS engineers themselves. The OEMs will do further customizations on this. And then that's what we ultimately see. But because of this hierarchical nature, that means fixes that happen, the open source reference implementation, take a long time to trickle down, right? Months and potentially years. And so a big point of this talk is to be, look, no one's a unique and beautiful snowflake. Everybody looks the same. So we took a ASUS machine that we did with our CanSec West talk. We did an analysis. We showed, here's all of these places where an attacker could hook all of the systems that are out there today. And we took that, we analyzed it, and so its control flow graph picture is a little bigger because it's got comments in it. But then you take a ASUS desktop and you take a MacBook Air, Ultrabook if you will, and the thing is, they look all the same, right? Their control flow graphs look the same. They call the same functions in the same order. There has to be some level of similarity in order for EFI or UEFI systems to implement that extensible firmware interface, right? There's a spec out there that says how the firmware interface works, and to conform to that, you have to look the same. So, call the same functions in the same order, have the same assembly in the same order. No one's system firmware, if they're EFI derived, is unique and beautiful snowflake. So that means that there's going to be shared vulnerabilities. All of the stuff that we've been disclosing over the past couple of years for PCs, does it affect Macs? Well, spoiler alert, yes. Right? So this means that there's all these vulnerabilities which are out there, and a lot of vendors don't necessarily pull in the code and the fixes from upstream, and they don't necessarily, they hear, oh, there's this PC attack, maybe it doesn't affect me, right? I'm a Mac. So beyond this, there's problems such as Intel has recommendations about protection mechanisms that vendors should use, and not all the vendors use those. Beyond that, there's still these decades of legacy decisions and things like option ROMs, which Trem will talk about later, which lead to sort of inherent built-in vulnerabilities. So we considered a bunch of different vulnerabilities. We took a bunch of old work and we said, do these apply to Mac? And so all of these should be old news at this point, right? These are all things which were responsibly disclosed over the last couple of years, publicly disclosed at conferences, and yet when we came along and we said, let's take a look at the Mac, are they still there? Yes, they are. Right? That's not cool. So the first thing to think about is the speed racer vulnerability. This is actually vulnerability in Intel hardware. So this is not the kind of thing which we would expect any given vendor to say I'm not vulnerable to, because if you're running chips, the core vulnerability is in Intel hardware, and the core fix is to use some Intel protection bits. But speed racer is going to be a race condition, a hardware race condition, and that we'll see why exactly that happens. So if you look at the BIOS control register on Intel hardware, this is sort of the oldest protection mechanism for the firmware. It says, okay, am I allowed to write to the BIOS? There's a BIOS write enable bit. That must be set before you're allowed to write to the BIOS. Now, if a vendor wants to stop any malicious OS attacker from writing into the BIOS, they need to set the BIOS lock enable bit. BIOS lock enable bit says, if someone sets the BIOS write enable bit, I want to cause a system management interrupt. I want this code that I've put into SMM, system management mode, I want to catch anyone trying to set the BIOS write enable, and I want to probably stop them from writing into the BIOS. So that's the oldest, most common functionality. But what the speed racer vulnerability disclosed is there's this hardware race condition where once we have multi-threaded hardware, right? So back in the day, that was just single-threaded hardware, single-core hardware, and so that protection mechanism worked great. Once you have multi-threaded, multi-core, hyper-threaded type hardware, you can have an attacker who just continuously hammers on the write enable bit. They say set it writable, set it writable, set it writable. And then in a separate thread, in a separate core, they continuously say write this value to the BIOS, write this value to the BIOS, write this value to the BIOS. And so the core race condition is those two threads continuously are just hammering on trying to write to the BIOS, and eventually we found that they're always able to succeed. This is the kind of race condition which an attacker likes, right? There's no penalty for failure, and beyond that, you just keep doing it long enough and you're always guaranteed to win. So, Corey talked about this back at CCC in December 2014. This was disclosed privately to Intel and CERT in May of 2014, and so this has been, out there for quite a while. So Intel's sort of response to this was, okay, well, we recognize that that could potentially be a problem, but we'd already added this new protection bit back in 2004 to our newer platform controller hubs, and this new bit says, even if the BIOS write enable is equal to 1 somehow, I still want to stop an attacker from writing into the BIOS unless they've broken their way into system management mode. So this bit says you must be in SMM before I allow you right to the BIOS. So that requires an extra exploit, an extra bit of effort on behalf of the attacker. They can't just race from kernel space and set and write to the BIOS. So this is basically the way that Intel says it should be. This is the way Intel recommends that BIOS vendors actually set their protection bits. So you've got layers of protection, each of which, provides some architectural value. So the BIOS lock enable says system management mode, they get to man the middle every attempt to write to the BIOS, and that will be stopped and checked. Well, that's the problem. The problem with that is SpeedRacer bypasses that. But if a vendor sets SMM BWP, then that will also say you must currently be in SMM before I'm going to let you write to the BIOS. And beyond that, there's further protection mechanism called protected range registers, and these allow the BIOS maker to set non-contiguous slices of the firmware as non-writable. And typically, a firmware maker would set the code as non-writable even from SMM. They basically say lock it down, and this is the kind of thing where it would be locked down, and you want that to be stopping an attacker in SMM from writing into the flash chip. So when we go back and we said, okay, let's consider this. Let's see whether or not this is Apple's vulnerable. First thing is we check the CERT vulnerability disclosures. So the really nice thing that we like about CERT vulnerability disclosures, the reason why we used CERT for our coordination, even when we were at MITRE and even when we had CVEs available to us, is that CVE just tells you these vendors are vulnerable and they've said they're vulnerable. The CERT ones are nice because CERT handles the coordination for you, and then they go around and ask the different vendors, are you vulnerable? And they get back responses. So there's going to be some vendors that say they're vulnerable, and then usually there'll be a link to their fix on the CERT disclosure. And then there's some vendors that say we're not vulnerable, and then there's vendors that don't say anything at all, and you can probably guess that they're going to be vulnerable. If they don't even care enough about firmware security to respond to vulnerability disclosures, they're probably going to be vulnerable. So we looked at Apple. Apple said it's not affected. Okay, well, this is a fundamental hardware race condition. All the Intel CPUs have this, so that bears investigation. And like I said, if vendors don't actually respond to these, and if you don't hold them accountable, if you don't say, hey, I saw this talk about whatever, are you actually vulnerable? They just aren't even going to say anything. So we need to check Apple. We need to say, is Apple vulnerable to this problem? So you go in, you look at the BIOS control register. The BIOS control register is set to 8. I won't make you do the bit math in your head for that. But the basic result is BIOS lock enable, not set. SMM BWP, not set. Right? So they're basically not using those first 2 layers of protections. So in a very technically accurate, pedantic sense of the word, Apple is not vulnerable to SpeedRacer because you don't need to use an exploit to get around protections that just aren't there. So this is what protection looks like on a new Mac system. I went out and bought the absolute newest Mac Mini, and this is the protections I saw. So you see, they're not even using the first 2 protection mechanisms, so that means they've got a single point of failure. Right? And beyond that, there are gaps. There are gaps in this region. The first gap points at the EFI variables. If you use the command line tool NVRAM, you can twiddle NV variable bits. But even some variables are prevented from being accessed by NVRAM. But if an attacker knows how to write to the flash chip, they can just bypass whatever Apple's API is to writing to the variables, write directly to the flash chip, and modify any variables that they want. Beyond that, there's an additional sort of gap in this protection, which we don't even know what that does, right? But as testing this sort of attack, we go ahead and we say, all right, corrupt that, write all X's into that, and let's see what happens. Well, what happens is the system is bricked. It will never ever boot again. Right? And that's undesirable behavior. So There's a video for that online which you can watch, but it's kind of hard to show, a cool demo video. Look, the system does not boot. It's just a picture of the system. So we decided to skip that, and you can watch that video online if you'd like. So, second thing we need to look at, Darth Anonymous vulnerability. I've got a goon crawling up here. I don't know what he's doing, but okay. So, Darth Anonymous vulnerability, right? So we saw that the protection mechanisms still have the protected range registers. Attacker would like to get around that, modify the code and stuff. And so that's exactly what the Darth Anonymous vulnerability allows an attacker to do. Sometimes called the Dark Jedi attack, this was named by Rafal Wojcik because basically Darth Plagueis defeated Darth Anonymous, killed him, put him into this, and then continued to resurrect him, and then kill him and resurrect him and kill him and resurrect him. I'm not, I don't know the exact story, and consequently it's been said that this is just like, maybe he didn't kill him, he put him into a coma, that sort of thing. But the analogy here is that we want to continuously kill and resurrect the system and use it to study the system, find vulnerabilities for science. So the Darth Anonymous vulnerability is the situation that when you put your system to sleep, just normal sleep, not a hibernate, not a, what does Apple call it, deep sleep. If you just put the system to sleep, close the lid, you're going into what's called ACPI S3 sleep. This is a low power mode where the hardware tries to power off as much of the motherboard as it can. Well, some of the stuff that it powers off is parts of the chipset which allow these protected bits to become unset, right? You're going into low power, you lose all of your electricity, and the bits get unset, right? And so this can be manipulated by an attacker. So this vulnerability was disclosed to CERT and the newly formed UEFI security response team back in September of 2014. And then this was publicly disclosed in December of 2014, as Trammell said, day before his talk, and wanted to find out whether this applies to Apple. So very, very quick, I recommend you go watch the actual talk if you want to know the details, but at the highest level, the details of Darth Anonymous are this. A normal system, when it's booting, is going to take that top path there. The normal boot path, you're going to execute each of your EFI or UEFI phases. As the system's booting, it's going to save information about which hardware configuration bits it's set to this little cheat sheet. This is boot script, this S3 boot script, which is going to be stored in RAM somewhere. Well, unfortunately, it's stored in unprotected RAM. That's the core of the vulnerability. But when you go into sleep and you wake back up, the resume execution path is going to say, instead of executing all of my normal boot code, which would make my resume from sleep as slow as a normal boot, I just want to consult the cheat sheet, and it will say, it has these type of operations. You can write to I/O, you can write to memory. And so you basically just go down the line and interpret this boot script, and that will make it so that the hardware will be reconfigured the same way it would be with a full boot, but much, much faster, right? That's why you have the nice, quick wake from sleep. But there's a core problem with this boot script, core vulnerability. The vulnerabilities are twofold. One, the script gets stored in non-protected RAM. And why does it get stored in non-protected RAM? Well, because you look at the spec document from 2004, and you can see right there, they're recommending storing it into this ACPI non-volatile memory. Well, the thing is that memory is just memory like any other memory. An attacker can manipulate it, compromise it. When they go to manipulate it, there's this one sort of catch-all opcode. There's this dispatch opcode. And the dispatch opcode says, whatever I need to do to configure hardware, it's too complicated for just, combination of reads and writes, things like that. So instead, I'm going to jump off, and I'm going to jump to some arbitrary code that's pointed to by the dispatch opcode. So a script that has jumps to arbitrary code plus an unprotected script somewhere in RAM means that attacker can compromise the script, get rid of the protected range registers, and have access to everything, get access to the code, modify the code so that right from the very beginning, all of the code is compromised by the attacker. So that's the net result of the Darth Anonymous attack. So when we go back and we say, did Apple say they were vulnerable or not vulnerable, look at these